Kevin, if you could just start by giving us a flavour of the book, White City.
Yes, we were speaking about mothers earlier on, so I'm going to read a short section in which Ben, my narrator, in the midst of his ill-fated attempt to get rich by partaking in a crooked property deal in the Balkans, goes to visit his mother. I don't think I'd like to take this opportunity to state publicly that the mother in my book bears no resemblance to my actual mother. It's a pity she isn't here to hear that.
It'll be on the recording, so we're sending her a message.
I will send her.
Not you, not you, not you.
The next day, I cabbed it to my parents' house to find out what my mother wanted. My original intention, of course, had been to ignore her summons, but my curiosity got the better of me. The vibe in the house was approximately that of Hitler's bunker circa April 1945. The curtains were drawn and the walls were bare. Through the open door of my father's study, a landslide of bankers' boxes spilled, shedding documents, notepads, folders, newspapers. My father himself was not in evidence. The hallway smelled of mildew and of something else, of vague sepsis. The kitchen looked uninhabited, like a showroom. On the counter, a laptop displayed a website, Hartford Realty, luxury homes in Connecticut, Vermont, and Maine. Beside it, a golf magazine invited its readers to kill your slice and pure your irons. Halfway down the garden, my mother was refilling the wire seed containers that hung from her bright blue wooden birdhouse. This was part of her daily routine. Birds were her acknowledged hobby. She kept an encyclopedia of Irish species on her bedside table and a pair of sniper-grade binoculars by the Belfast sink. Every morning she put fresh orange peel around the flower beds to ward off the neighbours' cats. The seed containers attracted chaffinches, goldfinches, pied wagtails. My mother cleaned the wire cages twice a week, wearing disposable rubber gloves to protect her from avian flu. Look at that. I suppose I can't avoid acknowledging at this point that my mother did, in fact, have a life outside drinking. She had birds. She had even taught me the names of birds when I was a kid. I'd forgotten that till now. She also taught me to dislike magpies, ill-mannered birds, she always said, thieves and jeerers. For her, the rules of politeness applied even to members of the animal kingdom. That was my mother. She could forgive anything except bad manners. On the patio table, I had now stepped outside, reposed a half-empty bottle of Chardonnay and a tray of empty wine glasses. After a moment, my presence seemed to cause some quantum fluctuation in the air. My mother became aware of me and pivoted, shading her eyes with a palm. "Since you're here," she called, "you might as well pour me a fresh glass." Through the greened-in branches of maples and birches above her head, the sunlight was finely tangled. I poured a glass for myself while I was at it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This is the opening of White City. Confession number 1. I'm a sick man. I'm an angry man. I think my wit's diseased. Could you gloss that? Could you give us where you were when you thought of that sentence? Or those, it's 2 sentences. And could you help us?
Yeah, I can tell you exactly where I was and when I was. It was Christmas 2015, and I was in the Blackrock Shopping Centre in South County Dublin. And I was Christmas shopping with my wife. She was not yet my wife. We were engaged at the time. And I had come through a crisis in my writing life and in my life more generally. I had published my first novel when I was 27. And it had done reasonably well. And I had then found myself unable to write another novel. And working through that crisis had led me to realize that what was blocking me was a sense of anger at how out of control my life felt when I published that novel. I was very young, 27. I was even younger than that, I think, emotionally. And I had found the experience of having a novel sort of taken out of my hands, printed, published, reviewed, bought for the movies, adapted for the movies, I'd found it completely
And become a
bewildering.
famous movie.
And become, successful and very good film. Lenny Abrahamson directed. I found it completely bewildering, and I had gradually got sort of so angry without being aware of it, because it's supposed to be great. If anyone had asked me how is your life going, I would have said brilliant. But actually, I think I was unprepared, and so I had recently, shortly before I thought of those opening lines, I'd become aware that I was angry, and this had really helped me to start cracking open some of the feelings that had been concealed from me, or I had been concealing from myself. And in a way, the dynamic of the book is about that precise experience of cracking open feelings that you have been concealing from yourself, which I'm very interested in as an experience, because I think it's universal or near universal. And I thought I'm angry, and then I thought, because I have a very book-oriented mind, I thought of the first line of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground.
Great. I was hoping you were going to say that.
Right. I'm a sick man. I can't even remember Dostoevsky's version. I've only got my version.
I mean, this is more or less a sort of a riff on the opening of
Notes from Underground.
Yeah.
By Fyodor Dostoevsky. And so I thought, I'm a sick man, I'm an angry man. And then another quotation popped into my head. I think my wit's diseased, and that's from Hamlet. And so I had glued together two quotations, and I realized that I had a rhythm going and almost a voice. And from that, eventually, the novel unspooled with much labor and pain and difficulty.
Do you have a third source for this?
Yes, John Banville's first novel.
Gotcha. I was wondering if you knew that.
For John Banville's first novel, Nightspawn, also begins with a quotation from Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground.
So you can just imagine my surprise as I read this and think, I think I know where he got this. And then I think, oh no, this got it in two places. The wit's diseased, I didn't. That's actually Hamlet.
Yes.
Yeah. My parents kept me home that week, so I never did Hamlet. But sorry, joke. But so in other words, what you're doing in this moment in the supermarket, as you're attempting to exit from this particular set of feelings, is you're finding another mask for the feelings. Yeah. It's not as though you want to write a book describing the life of a young novelist who's had huge success in South Dublin, who's totally miserable, but it is to find a metaphor, to find a character, to find a moment, and to find a literary style that's going to actually provide you with enough cover, in a way, that you can deal with these emotions in a way that isn't, so let's say, isn't direct or isn't, in a way, narcissistic.
Yeah. That's absolutely it. And a novel doesn't exist until, from my sense of it, until a rhythm. Now, it's not even words, it's not vocabulary, I wouldn't even call it style, it's just a rhythm. It's one sentence following another in a way that seems to me to contain enough rhythmic suggestion to give me the next sentence, and then the sentence after that. But that is, what is that? But precisely finding what it was really a very narrow channel through which to put all of this big chaos of emotion that you're trying to get in there. And that's...
So, I mean, what you're saying is that a novel isn't its theme, or it isn't its subject, or its content. It isn't even, in a way, its style. It's something stranger. It's an undercurrent in the sound. And even though the reader is reading silently, you're on your own with the book, and you can't hear the words. Oddly enough, you can. That whatever way it is, the words are on the page, they have an actual rhythm. That even in silence they have, which is the fundament, which is how you start, which is what the novel really depends on. Yeah. And it's like melody almost, that you kind of have a song without a melody.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I'm trying to write a novel at the moment, and what I have is chunks of what you could describe as theme or plot or event. But what I don't have is that rhythm yet, so I try again and again to write a page or two, and to see if I can get the deeper rhythm, because until that's there, the novel isn't there, and it's heard at that very, almost kind of below the threshold of the conscious reading mind.
And could that rhythm come in a supermarket where you're wandering around, you suddenly get a sound, and that becomes a sentence, and you write that down and you go home?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, and I'm always hoping for that moment. Yeah. It's rare.
You're talking about your when I mean you know what I mean. I'm talking about Ben. But Ben is talking about his mandatory sessions with his therapist. And he says, during my mandatory sessions with Dr. F, I have been availing myself of the therapeutic monologue, an undervalued art form, I feel. and in that, I'm hearing a whole lot of sly sound that I could hear, for example, in Nabokov. I could hear it in Martin Amis. I could hear it in Banville, just where you're making a sort of an insider joke about, well, you're obviously, since you're writing a therapeutic monologue,
Yes.
and then you can say an undervalued art form, meaning, so that's effectively the sort of form of the book is a therapeutic monologue. Yeah. Could you just talk to us about, well, I'm not sure I want you to go through every example beforehand of this, but there is that idea of someone who's been damaged, someone who's under pressure, someone who maybe hasn't spoken before, setting out in literary terms the actual events that caused the breakdown.
Yeah, I mean, there are many. I have many precedents for that idea. Philip Roth was another, great writer of therapeutic monologues, who kind of was at the back of my mind writing that line anyway. It's risky writing a book this long in the first person, all in the same first person. That's risky, and it may not work to everyone's taste. First person narratives should be relatively short, I think, because the danger is that, as with any therapeutic monologue, art will fall away, and a sort of hectoring, narcissistic self-regard will come in and sort of derail it. And my counterweight to that was plot, was having a bunch of stuff happening, some events, which I thought would pull him out of the kind of narcissistic spiral.
I mean, the other two sentences that could really throw light on the overall book are money changed hands and buildings rose and fell. It was like living in earthquake country. And in a way, you get that in two countries. But I think that the reason why you can do this first person over such a long book is, I think there are two things that make it work. One is that our hero, Ben, is a literary guy. In other words, he's been working on Stephen Dedalus' Portrait of the Artist, but he could be the student. There are certain moments where he could easily be the student at Swim Two Birds, just lying in bed, not getting up, not going to his lectures, and reading books and looking for wins and gambling, and so that he has to start with a literary style. So it isn't as though he's naive and you have to keep thinking, would he know this? Would he say this? Would he write in this way? Since he's been doing his PhD, or since he's not been doing his PhD, but nonetheless he's been thinking a lot about fiction. So it is in a way a portrait of the artist as a young man. And I suppose the second thing is that you're able to just go Serbia, Dublin, and italics, so that you do have a texture, you can move from one to the other, which I think stops it, if it was ever becoming monotonous, which it doesn't do, that you've worked out in a way structural ways of stopping that.
Yeah, and that took me an unbelievably long time. And I'm sort of disappointed nobody's come to me and said, God, the structure of this is brilliant, because I spent forever trying to work it out. But thank you, Colm, for finally saying it. But yeah, and I mean, I had charts and I had maps and I had post-it notes and I had, I showed this to my students a few years ago and they said, well, this is like a little craft project. And I said, well, yeah, what do you think writing a novel is?
So give us the dates. So the first novel is published in
2008.
And this?
2021.
So when did this start?
It started, actually, I wrote a version of what became that opening. It didn't have the Dostoevsky and it didn't have the Banville and all that, but a version of those first few pages shortly after my first novel came out. And looking back, it's interesting that I found myself writing a confessional monologue, a therapeutic monologue at that moment of when my life was about to change and become much more confusing and difficult in some ways. And I had about 5 pages and that sat neglected on my hard drive for a very long time. And then around about 2012, I had been in Serbia. I spent a week in Serbia, or 2 weeks in Serbia, on a kind of book event, literary festival in 2010. And it wasn't quite this bad, but it was strange. It was a strange experience. And I kept frantic notes while I was there of all the strange things that people were saying and doing. And I tried to turn it into a novel, and what I had there was this very knockabout comic novel, very, very hastily and badly written, and that sort of didn't go in. It got about 200 pages. Put that aside, that wasn't going to work. And then after that, I started trying to write a novel essentially about Sean Fitzpatrick, who fascinated me, and whose trial I attended with my late dad, who was also very interested in his case. And some of that stuff ended up in here as well.
Describe this further. You and your father went in every day?
Not every day, no. We popped in, I think, a couple of times.
Did you put on suits and stuff, or,
No, my dad was working in town at the time, and I just met him.
And it was easy to get in?
Wandered up. You could just go in. You could just walk in. You could just attend a trial in the criminal courts of justice at Parkgate Street there. You can just walk in, unless it's been, protected in some legal way. But in that case, we did. We were curious. We were interested, and I found Fitzpatrick a really, really interesting character. I mean, the dad, doesn't really bear too much resemblance to him, except in certain ways. But the ghost of that idea, a novel about a Sean Fitzpatrick character, is very much here as well. And that moment of realizing that I had that voice, the Dostoevsky voice almost, the therapeutic monologue voice, meant that I could then glue together or suture together. Perhaps that's a slightly more elegant way of describing the process. The Serbian material that I was kind of thinking about, wanting to write about an Irish banker during the last 10 years or so, and then my own. I could find in these things an analogue for some of my own emotions.
I'll come back to that in a second. I just want to ask you, are you actually yourself an old barbarian?
No, I'm not. So I grew up in Rathcoole in County Dublin, which is a kind of small town off the nice dual carriageway, the N7. And I went to a school there called Holy Family Community School, which was not a fee-paying school. And I had no idea schools of old barbarians even existed until I went to UCD as an undergrad to study English. And there I met people who had gone to Blackrock and Gonzaga and various other old South Dublin institutions and became fascinated by them. And novelists are fascinated by closed worlds, I think. And I had felt I had stumbled upon this closed and coded world. And I thought, God, I got to write about this. And then Paul Harrod started writing about it, and I thought, shit. But he does such a wonderful job, and he himself has taught me a great deal about that world just from reading the Ross O'Carroll Kelly books. But yeah, no, I do not come from that world.
It certainly happened to me, where you don't get told in Wexford, in your diocesan boarding school, that there is such a thing as that level of entitlement you're going to find when you arrive in UCD and you go to your first history lecture and you realize that some of the undergraduates, age 17, are already wearing suits and ties. And they already know they're going to be barristers, and then they know they're going to be judges. And not only that, but they did become barristers, and they are judges. And they spoke in a certain tone, they moved in a certain way, and they all had been to either Gonzaga or Belvedere. And they saw differences between Belvedere and Gonzaga. I just saw their astonishing, I'm talking about, obviously they're all blokes, their astonishing levels of entitlement. And the fact they didn't have to work in the summer, and that you certainly, as an outsider there, you see, Blackrock didn't impinge because forgive me, anyone from Blackrock, but in general, Blackrock people didn't come to do English. I mean, I know you sort of didn't notice them as Blackrock people because the Blackrock people were actually rugby players, and rugby players didn't tend to be interested, in Henry James, and but it's certainly true that the way in which those rings were formed, and look, there are certain moments in the book that are so iconic in White City. The moment where they decide, yes, if we're going to have a launch, it will be the Shelburne, and if we're going to do it, we need to have our fathers present. And of course, you have this sort of Hamlet figure, whose father cannot be present, and whose mother is a sort of Gertrude wandering about. But the others they're really a chip off the old block, and you watch that generational thing, that entitlement thing, and it seems natural and ordinary. But I mean, it's also very dramatic when it's seen as though chronicled, as though from outside.
Yeah, I mean, I had the same experience, a few years later when I was an undergrad at UCD, and I remember standing in the Forum Bar, which was the kind of the campus bar at the time, and looking around it, and there were a bunch of people who were in the Literary and Historical Society, and they were in their suits, and they were drinking and talking to one another, and it was as if I were already looking at them in 30 years, when they would be judges, lawyers, barristers, journalists, and TDs, and lo and behold, I have watched those people become those things. People who were a year behind me in UCD English have been ministers for things, naming no names. They have become extremely powerful and influential in this country, and I had no idea. And the revelation of privilege and of a sudden clear sense of how class perpetuates itself and how it operates struck me, as I say, it struck me with such force that I've now written 2 novels about it, which to some degree suggests that I can't get over it.
Could you talk to us about the first novel?
The first novel, yeah. So Bad Day in Black Rock was even more directly about that world than White City is. And it came out of a failed previous attempt to write a novel, which had been a kind of an attempt to write a sort of South Dublin, family novel, which would try and look at some of these themes. I was very young. I was about 23, 24 when I wrote that. But in it, I had alluded to a certain case that's well known, or was well known at the time. And Frank McGuinness, who had been helping me with my work and had been a brilliant mentor, he was teaching in UCD at the time, and I was there. And he had circled this bit in the manuscript and said, "We should write about that." And I thought, oh, Jesus, I can't do that. But then I realized that I could and did, and I knew enough about this closed and coded world to make a story out of it. Because
are we allowed to say what the newspaper story is?
I don't know. Are we? Probably.
Well, it's obvious. I mean, to anyone who reads the book, but we need to say it now that it was the kicking of a guy to death outside Annabelle's nightclub, which was a big trial and it was very much watched trial because of the middle class. These were middle class kids. These were effectively kids from Blackrock College, and so that was Yeah.
And I thought I realized that I could tell that story because I had been spying on these people, going to parties in their houses, getting to know them, learning the codes of the world. I remember a friend I made in college. I went to a party in his house, and he brought us upstairs, and he opened the wardrobe in his bedroom, the closet, if you will. And in the closet was his old school uniform, preserved as if in, mothballs. And I thought, what the hell is this? It was Dorian Gray. It was like, here's who I am, preserved in the Dorian Gray attic of my life. And I knew I had read at that point Cyril Connolly's Enemies of Promise, where he says that, the experience of going through to one of the great English boarding schools is so dramatic and profound that everything else afterward in life seems like a disappointment. And that, to me, which George Orwell completely took the piss out of, because he said that's absolutely ridiculous, and he had gone to the same school as Cyril Connolly and knew whereof he spoke. But anyway, and I thought, this is real. This is a real phenomenon. These people have peaked in school, and to me, the idea that I would have had the best period of my life in secondary school is horrifying. And because school, you got through school and then you got out. That was how you felt about school, as far as I was concerned. But this was different, and I knew that if you had a bunch of people who lived in that world, then you had the material for a novel, because novels they thrive. The novel form thrives on rules, on identifiable codes of social behavior. And I knew I could write about it because I knew some of the rules.
And so in the first novel, you have them as thugs, as young thugs. And in the second novel, you have them as young businessmen.
Yeah. The same guys.
In other words, once again, we're in the world of watching from outside. In other words, that I live in the centre of Dublin, and there they are in the street, and they've always got, one telephone is about to be replaced by another, and they're doing deals on the phone, and they're going to rugby. And anyway, that you're able to do this business of the outside, the single outsider who's able to observe this world. He's one of them. He's not one of them. He thinks they trust him because he was in school with them, and they want someone who's more articulate than them, who will be able to help them in their business. And so you have that lovely business, which belongs to the novel, of the insider-outsider figure, of he's more literate than them. He notices more than them. And he's also more self-deluded than them. And so you watch, you're talking about codes, his code of watching and their code in a way of, they have everything sewn up, actually. Yeah. And so you have a sort of, I suppose you get a lot of literary energy from his insider-outsider.
Yeah, yeah. It's the ideal figure to narrate a novel. Because they both know the rules and are capable, first of all, of noticing that there are rules. Second of all, of feeling that there perhaps shouldn't be, or that the rules should be different. And once you've got that tension in the perception of your narrator, then you've got great literary energy comes out of that.
And so you can draw pen pictures of each of them, including a fellow called Mark Foley. And you describe in school he had been a gamer and a comics geek. And actually what you're talking about here is a sort of, help me with the narrator of Gatsby. Nick Carraway. Nick in The Great Gatsby, he's both inside and outside. He's a friend of Tom's. He can talk to Gatsby. He knows Daisy. He's in all the world, but yet he works for a living. And yet, none of them really knows the extent to which he's charting what they're doing. And then it goes that Mark Foley, when I heard he'd gone to Trinity to study business, I wrote him off entirely. And now, I was, of course, getting ready to write him off again as soon as I was rich enough to leave the lads behind forever. We might have been friends, Mark and I, if we hadn't been in our own separate ways such self-deluding dickheads. What you're watching here, of course, is our hero, Ben, as a novelist, really enjoying pinning down these guys. And we're watching you, in your own way, just getting that rhythm there where you're coming to, the dismissal of them. But obviously, really, really amusing yourself. Take me through Cleo.
Yes. Cleo is the girl that Ben meets at the very beginning of his crisis. His father brings him in, takes him to the Greystones driving range and says, "We're out of money and we have to cut you off." And so he responds as many of us would, by going out and getting drugs or trying to. He ends up at a book launch and he meets Cleo. Cleo, I made her an actress because I wanted to take the piss out of the Dublin theatre scene. I'll be honest.
Speaking of rules and cliques, yeah. Okay, go on.
Because, and I had one of the most fun pages of the book to write was the play
that Cleo it's really good.
Puts on. That was one of the most fun because I have sat through a lot of my friends work in theatre and are actors, and I apologise to them unreservedly for the portrait I made of their world in the novel. But it is also very funny to me, and I had sat through a lot of bad plays, and I had sat through a lot of ill-written, but sort of liberally well-meaning, agit-prop theatre over the years. And I knew that because I wanted to write a funny book, it was a primary motivation for me. I knew that I would be able to get jokes out of actors. You can always get jokes out of actors. But Cleo is there structurally, functionally, so that he can misunderstand her and misread her. One of my favorite bits in the novel is when he catches a glimpse of the searches on her iPhone, and one of them is, "In a relationship with a narcissist, what do?" And he makes no comment on this, but he should, because it's the definitive analysis of him at that point in his life. And so I gave Cleo as much I hope likability and sanity and kindness as I could, and then had him repeatedly misunderstand that and abuse her trust and lie to her, because he is a self-deluding dickhead at points.
He also can watch things and define them very succinctly. There's this sentence really made me shiver when it says they dwelt perpetually in that sub-realm of cultural endeavor, where what you were asked to admire is not the thing achieved, but the effort expended in trying to achieve it. I think all of us know that feeling. You write a book, you think, well, hold on, I spent a lot of time on this book. And you want to be admired for that, as though somehow the book isn't the thing, but your work on it. So I shivered a bit with that. But I think any of us who have written plays really worry a lot. You know that play where you go to and there are three figures on the stage looking out at you, and they're doing monologues at you in the lights, and they're all dressed in black, and she goes 2 steps from this is poor Cleo, 2 steps from Aleppo to a boat on a raging sea. They're swept into a worldwide web of stress, their lives a mess, they're bloody dispossessed, alone, drone bombed, and all the words rhyme as it goes along, and then the guy takes over. Yeah, you must have really enjoyed, I mean, it just puts an end to that sort of play, I think, you know.
That was my goal, yeah. I'm afraid not, though.
The parents are lonely, and so it isn't. I mean, sometimes it's a comedy, and sometimes you watch as the whole idea that there's a haunting in the book, which is the death of the uncle, and the father's coming from the farm, and the father's feeling somehow that everything he got on his own, that he doesn't have any sense of his own entitlement. And the mother is just wandering in her own way, just drinking a lot and watching birds. And the relationship with the son is really distant. He feels as though he doesn't know them or doesn't answer their texts. And so it is about that idea of a generation that has really lost its connection to the previous generation.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite striking, because to hear you say it, I realize it's true. They are lonely, actually, and to the extent that they're in the book at all. You see them they're either together or they're alone. They don't seem to have friends. They don't seem to have a social kind of context that much. That's quite interesting.
I think that generation of Irish businessmen who all lost it, you know, in the boom. And were all put on trial, and then there were ones who weren't. And some got away with it, and some didn't. But there is a sense of them having a great connection to Serbia itself, in that Serbia, in that war in the former Yugoslavia, got blamed for everything, but it never took the blame. It never felt we caused the war, we were the worst ones. They blame NATO, they blame Croatia, they blame Bosnia, they blame Muslims, they blame everyone. But they don't actually take responsibility for that war themselves. I mean, at least up to now, they haven't. And it's one of the features of being there is you realize they actually blame NATO. Yeah. And this comes out, but there's a connection between this group of Irish business people who brought the country down in a certain way and this country that did the same thing, and both of them feeling, why are you blaming us for this? Did you?
I mean, in a sense, just the fact I was invited to Serbia in 2010, and I just said, "Sure, I'll go to Serbia," and I couldn't have gone anywhere better, in a sense, because of what Ireland was currently going through post 2008, and precisely because I was struck, I felt like an American going to, you know, wherever, post-war Berlin or something, because a lot of Serbia in 2010, anyway, I have not been back, is very economically, you know. It's dilapidated, it's crumbling and all that. And I felt like I was coming from a rich, you know, industrial contemporary country. And I also knew that was an unusual experience for an Irish person to have. And I suddenly realized that what I could do was juxtapose these two countries and hopefully bring out some, as you say, some of the strange parallels there. I mean, I was also extremely lucky because I was invited to various kind of literary events. And at one of these events, a Russian poet was given a literary award, and there's a strong pro-Russian current in Serbian culture, and it's, you know, they're pro-Putin, and they're very kind of, you know, there's ties between Serbian nationalism and Russian nationalism, and I was lucky enough to see this very formal presentation of prize to the Russian poet, and then also to hear the more left-wing literary people, Serbian literary Serbs who were there, express disgust and disapproval that the formal literary culture was approving of this strain of Serbian nationalism and publicly avowing ties to Russia, Russian nationalism and Putinism. And I thought, this is great. This is great material. And it didn't make it into the final draft because I just couldn't organize the book in such a way that he would be at a literary prize giving. It just wasn't going to pan out. But it struck me that we had recently seen our own version of what Serbia had gone through, which was realizing that as a generation of patriarchal, businessmen had been revealed to be kind of rotten to the core, and that the system that we all lived in was rotten to the core. And yet there we were. We had our lattes and our iPhones and our Starbucks, and but it just seemed too good a chance to pass up to kind of juxtapose those two countries and to try and bring out the kind of thing that you're mentioning there.
Has anyone asked you, and I'm not asking you, just in case you're wondering, I'm not asking you, but I'm wondering, has anyone asked you how you did the research about all the drugs?
I have been asked that question, yes.
The British officer is not listening.
The American novelist Robert Stone, who used to hang out with Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters in the 60s, was asked later on in his career, what is your relationship to hard drugs now? And he said, I admire them from afar. I will repair behind that answer, I think.
But the concoctions, I mean, some of the concoctions would really make your heart stop. And like, there's never one Xanax or half a Xanax. It's 2 Xanax, it's 3 Xanax. And some of the stuff is new to me as well. I have to say, at my age, it better be new to me. But it is. It does make a very big difference to the book. I think it's that idea of his interest in consumption. It becomes enormous from someone who's just not doing his PhD, who's sort of living vicariously off his parents, whatever money they give him, that actually he's now slowly moving into a world where he really does want, and he lists what he wants, but he also wants Nikki. He also describes what he wants. There's a wonderful moment where he wants a 5K run every Saturday morning with her in Phoenix Park. I just think, hold on. With all your with all your drugs as with you, and he's always sort of I was going to say stapling, but sticking drugs onto bits of the kitchen and bits of his underbelly and stuff. But there's another life he does dream of, and it's a pure space. So all of this work he's doing with these old barbarians, is really so that he can find a clearing in the forest for himself. It's always about going. It's always about never seeing them again, never seeing anyone again. That there's some dream he has of a place that will be pure.
Yeah. I mean, this is in recovery. Look, the only thing I've ever been addicted to is cigarettes, and I've extrapolated. I think you can learn a lot about being addicted to cigarettes, actually, what addiction is and how it works. In recovery, they call this the geographical solution, the idea that if you remove yourself physically from where you are taking all these drugs or drinking or gambling, things will change. And of course, it's a myth. It's in there in the same way that, drugs function in the book, I hope as a source of comedy, because if you take someone whose mind has been altered and put them in a taxing social situation, that will be funny. But they also function as a kind of objective correlative of denial, of the state of denial or of refusing to look that he is in. And this is, I think this is what most substances do for us, and sometimes usefully, in moderation, sometimes less usefully. But one of the things that, I've known people who've taken a lot of drugs, and it has seemed to me that what they're doing is not looking at certain feelings that they don't want to have, and that's one of the main things that this book is about.
You say you were addicted only to cigarettes. I would suggest that you had other addictions, some of them to words, and certain sorts of words. And I speak, I think, for the entire audience here. Not that we've discussed this in advance, but I know you have to think this, where someone's gums on page 238 are gingivitic. I didn't have to look it up. I said, you mean gingivitis, which I take to be a disease of the gums. So I love gingivitic gums. I love the hallway smell. Well, you actually read this just now. The hallway smelled of mildew, and if something else, a vague sepsis. You go, It smelled of sepsis. And, you go on, the water looked protozoic. Protozoic is great. And I looked up protozoic, so I know all about protozoic. And the speed, this is great. This is the speed, meaning this is the drug speed. It was ramifying dendritically throughout my central nervous system. Dendritically, I presume dendritically was the way in a tree all the rings go. But then when I looked it up, I found that
Crystallization. Yeah, it's the.
Come on, Professor.
You're making me realize I should not have used any of these words.
What?
Dendritically is where you. It describes the shape made by a structure as it crystallizes, and it sort of spreads outwards.
Ramifies dendritically throughout. I thought that was pretty good. And then this one's really great. The hingeless seesaw. This is your effort to describe a children's playground in Serbia. The hingeless seesaw, right? Got that. The unsprung rocking horse, right? And then the tetanus-infested slide. I just thought the slide is infected. Sorry, infested. No, it's infested. Yeah. The slide is infested with tetanus. Oh my God, tetanus. The only thing I know about tetanus is an anti-tetanus injection. But and on page 347, which I'm going to come to now, you actually have these. You have a low serotonin sky, a low terrace. So T.S. Eliot would love that. A low. Do you remember the opening of Prufrock? Let us go there, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky. And you must be going to say something beautiful now about it, like a patient etherized upon a table, and so that it was a low serotonin sky, a mood disorder sky. So that there's all of this, I suppose, a sort of dark version of things finding its way, in the lexicon of sort of like tetanus, gingivitis. What's that other thing? Sepsis. I mean, you're having a tremendously good time with giving this Ben a sort of dark vision where if he opens a door, there are going to be dead pigs hanging down, and they're going to look like people. Like no matter where he goes, these sort of images are there. So they're sending him off to a sort of, I suppose, a dark underspace, a sort of Balkans of the soul, where instead of finding himself, he just finds all these terrible images, and he has even worse dreams. So instead of being the paradise, in other words, he's dreaming of the paradise, but he's actually in some sort of underworld. Yeah. So it is Ben in the underworld.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's where the Notes from Underground kind of, quotation in the opening paragraph, is giving you a clue that this is going to be essentially a book about an inferno, a trip down into the depths of hell, which is, I mean, the hell is all of these things that he's seeing they're there, but what he's seeing is his own soul. When he sees a tetanus-infested slide, when he smells sepsis, when he opens the door and sees, but what he's seeing is himself. Not to get too pretentious about it,
but there I think there are moments also where you can see his reading. For example, there's a sentence: "Here the trees were dumping their melancholy garbage of used leaves as they did annually, like punctual householders." And once more, you have that sort of idea that Beckett's "The Sun Shone," having no alternative. You have that like this guy's been reading books, We're going to go to questions in 1 second, but just one last question from me is, are we ever going to have a novel with a good psychiatrist? In other words, if this Dr. F really goes very far, doesn't he, in sort of pushing poor Ben towards all sorts of Freudian, post-Freudian, sub-Freudian, Lacanian, like he really is quite evil in the way he's pursuing this, isn't he, Dr. F?
Machiavellian, perhaps. I don't know if evil.
Right. Okay.
Because his ultimate aim is good. But he believes that the end is justified by the means. Or the means are justified to attain that end. I mean, I invented a therapist. I invented the only kind of therapist that I thought would work on me. if I were in that situation, which is essentially someone who bullied, tricked, abused, and broke me down. Because I didn't think, people, when people go to therapy, they often go unconsciously in search of just a better story to tell about themselves. And therefore, they don't really get down to the root of what's going on. I've done this myself, God knows. So I didn't want to create a therapist who was going to do that for either the reader or for the character. I wanted a therapist who was going to be more than his equal and show him and show us precisely how much of a self-deluding dickhead he is. And also, he's funny. That's it. I wanted to make it funny.
Kevin, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.